Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, as you know, during these History Hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great work being done by scholars who have used the historical resources held in the Hagley Library, especially folks who have received support in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds from the Hagley Center. One such scholar joins me today. Emily Wells is a PhD candidate at the College of William and Mary. Emily, thanks for speaking with me today.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Let's start by painting with broad strokes. What is it you're researching and writing about?
Yeah. So right now I'm writing a dissertation that examines the experiences of elite white Southern girls between the American Revolution and the Civil War. And when people think about Southern girlhood, especially from this period, often the first image that comes to mind is the Southern Belle, or more specifically, Scarlet O'Hara from Gone with the Wind. And this archetype of female adolescence is really ingrained into our collective memory of the early national and antebellum South, but it's not an accurate representation of Southern girlhood. And the purpose of my dissertation is really to look beyond the Southern Belle and examine how elite white girls thought about themselves and their place in the world during the early national and antebellum periods. And specifically, I'm interested in how girls thought about the relationship between place and social identity. So each chapter of my dissertation focuses on a different geography or spatial framework. And some of these geographies were places that we might recognize today on a map, while others were intimate spaces known only to a small number of people. So, for example, in one chapter, I examine how girls map the boundaries of nations and empires, while in another, I investigate how girls navigated the physical space of their home and the social space of their household. And then other geographies were more imaginary than real. So, for example, in one chapter, I look at how girls mapped aesthetic tropes from sentimental literature onto physical landscapes. So that's kind of like the broad strokes summary of my dissertation.
Sure. What a fascinating subject. And I really, really like how you've organized that with this geographic focus. Um, let's sort of unpack some of the pieces then. I notice this is about girlhood, so obviously gender plays a really important role. What is different? What might be the result of framing it about girlhood as opposed to childhood in the same period?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, well, part of it is I just needed a narrow focus.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that helps kind of look narrow down what I'm looking at because there really is such a large amount of childhood manuscripts in archives. I was surprised at the outset how much I was finding, and I think if I was focusing on boys and girls, it would just been overwhelming.
Hmm.
But also, I am interested in girls and women more broadly and gender history. And I think I've always come into this project with that focus, and I haven't really considered why. But I think in general, I'm interested in the ways that girls move through the world and how that was different from their male counterparts, how it might have been more constrained or more free in a lot of
Hmm.
ways. So I do compare their experiences with those of, close male family members like brothers or male counterparts of the same age. Um, so gender is a very, you know, significant portion of
Yeah,
my research.
I see how it both is a limiting factor, but also opens a lot of interpretive windows, as it were. Yeah,
Exactly.
well, that's great. Well, how did you come to have this spatial conception of the subject?
Yeah, well, I actually started my dissertation research looking specifically at geography education and looking at it more in from an institutional framework, how schools were teaching geography during this time period, specifically how girls' schools were teaching geography. But then as I continued my studies and continued my research, I became more and more interested in how um, girls thought about place outside of the classroom. And so this spatial organization really came from this initial interest in geography education and expanded outward to a more general definition of space and place.
Well, let's sort of get right to that then. How are you defining the South? Because that's another key framework here, isn't it?
It is. Well, that is kind of one of the central questions of my dissertation is what is the South? And more specifically, who is a Southern girl?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and in part, I'm trying to figure out how girls thought about themselves. Would they have defined themselves as Southern girls? And in a lot of cases, many of these girls had familial connections and social connections across the United States. They may have lived in the South, but they had aunts and uncles in New England, or they attended school in a northern city. Um, so there's this very complex um, self-identification going on, but at the same time, I needed to narrow in on who I was going to look at and what materials I was going to study. So I gave myself the framework of I am going to look at materials that came from states where slavery was legal during the time period that I study. So Delaware counts within that framework.
Mhm.
And that's how I came to Hagley and came to the DuPont sisters. So I have my own definition of the South, but I'm really interested in how the girls define the South and define Southern identity.
Mhm. Well, I'm so glad that you've introduced Hagley here and the DuPonts. Could you perhaps explain what it was that you accessed in the Hagley collections to help you do this research?
Yeah, so at Hagley, I studied correspondence, schoolwork, and other manuscripts written by Victorine, Evelina, Eliotera, and Sophie DuPont prior to 1830. And these girls were the daughters of Eliotère Irene DuPont and his wife, Sophie Madeleine DuPont. Victorine and Evelina were born in France during the 1790s, while Eliotera and Sophie were born after the DuPonts had established a home for themselves in Delaware. So nearly 2 decades elapsed between the birth of the eldest sister, Victorine, and the youngest, Sophie. And so for me, this is really useful because it allows me to establish a case study that extends across multiple decades. While I was there, I also studied objects from the museum collection
Oh boy.
that were made or used by the DuPont sisters, and I familiarized myself with the landscape that they wrote about in their letters.
Well, that's a really rich package of materials, isn't it?
It is, especially because I focused so much on place. It was amazing to study these manuscripts and then be able to go walk through the actual landscape that they were describing.
Hmm.
Um, and I had a lot of fun matching up places with the help of Lucas Clausen to locations mentioned in the letters.
Oh, that's great. Lucas Clausen, of course, being the Hagley resident historian in the library and museum. That's great. Was there perhaps a specific document or set of documents that were especially useful or enlightening for you, given the task you've set yourself?
Yeah, so for me, correspondence is the richest archive because that's where girls, I guess, talk more intimately about their lives, especially correspondence exchanged between the sisters or between them and their friends of the same age. You get a much more personal insight into who they were and what they were experiencing. And I come across a lot of discussion of their formal geography education. They talk a lot about drawing maps and studying geography, attending geographical examinations at other schools. But they also talk about their experiences and perceptions of the landscapes around them. So there's a lot of talk about the landscape that is now the Hagley Museum. Um, and there's also a lot of discussion about other places that they visited, and they interpret these landscapes through a very personal lens. And they actually are my main source of material for my study of sentimental geographies. They read a lot of sentimental literature, and they would often interpret these landscapes through that lens of sentiment and sentimental novels.
Why was geography so central to their education?
Yeah, so geography became a very popular subject for girls and young women around the mid to late 18th century. It kind of came out of this Enlightenment focus on modern sciences and incorporating modern sciences into childhood education, both for boys and for girls. Um, and by the time Victorine and Evelina, Eleonora, and Sophie were attending school, it was just part of the standard curriculum that all girls of their class received. And I look at why that was. I kind in part it was just because it was the fashion, but also it was because girls um, would have been expected to know about the world and be able to converse about the world when they were adults. Um, and they were expected just to have a basic knowledge of the places not only that they experienced personally, but also of the world at large so that they could participate in these, global networks of trade and conversations about current events. Yeah.
Mhm. Now, I'd like to hear a little bit more about the sentimental geographies and how the DuPont girls were expressing themselves through this interpretation of landscape.
Yeah, so that is one of my favorite things to look at because I think it's so interesting to see how girls really entered this imaginary world alongside the authors that they read. So sentimental novels were especially popular during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So right around the time that the DuPont sisters were um, learning to read and engaging with literary material. So they read a lot of poetry, novels, and other literary materials that fell within this sentimental genre. They created copybooks that where they wrote down quotations from their favorite works. And then in their letters, they often cast themselves as heroines um, of their own stories. Sometimes they directly called themselves heroines. And then they talked about the places they encountered through the sentimental lens. So they were really interested in, islands where they could go and romantically be in nature or cottages where they could pretend to be, sentimental cottagers. And they really kind of inhabited this literary world and mapped it onto their daily experiences.
And and uh, I'm familiar or not familiar, but I've seen in the archives a map drawn by one of the DuPont girls of their immediate environment, and it is a very whimsical interpretation of the landscape. Could you perhaps speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, yeah. So it's interesting to look at the documents and maps that they drew of Hagley and compare it to other interpretations of that landscape that were more
Mm.
focused on the industrial aspect. They were very much, at least in from what they wrote down, they were more interested in Hagley as a natural space and the kind of wild, romantic nature of it. So they did not often engage with the mill site. They, would more often, go up the river or go into the woods around their family's home. Um, and their experience of that landscape was very different from the experience of their male relatives or the workers' families. Um, that's not to say they completely avoided those areas of the estate, but they what they considered to be kind of their home or the place that was most central to their experience was very separate from that industrial area that characterizes the landscape.
Does that bring in the theme of keeping within compass, the which is a quote that is part of the title of your project, at least tentatively?
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, they were very much, keeping within the compass of what was expected of them.
Mm.
They were young women. They were expected to move in circles that, um, within these elite social circles, and physically they were expected to remain within landscapes that were designated for their use. So the home or the surrounding countryside, these feminine landscapes. Um, and yeah, so their movements through Hagley really reflect that expectation of um, their social movement.
Mm. Now, their interpretation of space and their movement through these spaces, it seems to me you're at least implicitly arguing that this helped these girls and young women navigate the exploration of their own identities and their position in the larger world, and perhaps even the growth from girlhood to womanhood. Is that part of your story?
It is, yeah. So um, they were aware of the expectations placed upon them, and they, for the most part, accepted that their future role as wives and mothers. But they also rebelled against it a little bit. They were very keen to hold on to girlhood for as long as possible. I'm thinking especially about Victorine and her school friend Rebecca. They were very close friends, and they wanted to kind of prolong the happiness they had experienced while attending school together. So they established these imaginary spaces where they could spend time together, whether in person or through their imaginations, through their correspondence. Um, and through these spaces, they kind of established a separate um, geography for themselves that they could inhabit together, and that where they could avoid the obligations that they would otherwise have to fulfill. So, for example, they adopted a house in the country. It was an abandoned cottage, and they went there and basically just spent time together. And they loved doing that, but they also expressed dissatisfaction about going back into the city or going to social events where they would be expected to converse with people that they weren't as close with or to engage in courtship rituals. So they really established these separate geographies where they could prolong their girlhood and kind of forestall womanhood for just a little bit.
Mm, that's so interesting. Um, would the DuPont girls have considered themselves Southern to sort of bring back your overarching theme of the sort of archetypal Belle, and whether that really upholds under scrutiny?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So they had social and familial connections in both the North and the South. They were, so they really had a broad social network. They never really talked about themselves as Southern or Northern. The closest I've gotten is a letter written to Eliotera during the Civil War from one of her friends in South Carolina. And her friend says that Eliotera and her family are almost Southern, which kind of really speaks to that in between space that they occupied.
Mhm.
Um, so it just really wasn't a focus of their letters. It wasn't something they really explored. And I think that in itself speaks to this idea that North and South weren't really salient identities for a lot of people, especially in the years and decades that preceded the Civil War. Of course, when you get to the 1850s and 1860s, it becomes much more of a salient identity. But at least during the period that I'm studying, it wasn't top of mind. That wasn't how they primarily identified. They identified as, the inhabitants of Elletarian Mills. They identified as Philadelphia schoolgirls. So their geographical identities were much more local than North or South.
Mhm. Oh, that's so fascinating. How does that compare with some of your other subjects, let's say in points south? Or I might ask, what are some of your other case studies and where are they situated?
Yeah, so a lot of my case my case studies are coming from all over the um, the South, as I define it. My furthest, the furthest west I go currently is Louisiana and the Gulf South. Um, and I see a lot more similarities between the case studies, in Louisiana and South Carolina and Georgia, and the case studies like the DuPont sisters in Delaware and Maryland. There really wasn't a whole lot of variation. There was a bit, especially, but that variation came less from their identity as Northern or Southern and more from the particularities of their experience. So if they lived on a plantation or a mill site like the DuPont sisters, or if they lived in town, those were much more salient to defining their experience.
Now, one thing I find very interesting about your project and your use of the Hagley collections is that you're doing this rather intimate social history research, and yet you're using what is nominally a business and industrial history focused archive. And so, could you perhaps speak a little bit to that, how you can use this business archive to get at your subject, which at first glance seems unrelated, but nevertheless you've shown how useful it can be.
Yeah, so always felt like the odd one out because I was doing research that was completely unrelated to the research being done by the scholars around me. But it is kind of fun to come into a space that's focused on one thing and look at the collections that are maybe not as highlighted. So the DuPont family papers, I think, are, at least from my understanding, are fairly foundational to the Hagley archive. They
Mhm.
were collected and preserved by the sisters when they were older, and then their descendants. And then they became part of the Hagley collection when it was founded as a museum, as an archive. Um, so I feel like they are really at the core of Hagley just because they were there at its inception. Um, but it is unusual for the focus of the archive. And but it is remarkable that this is actually one of the largest and most complete archives of girlhood correspondence and manuscripts that I've ever come across,
Um,
just because they were so well preserved. So Hagley is unique in that as well.
Well, Emily, what a fantastic project, and I sincerely look forward to reading your dissertation when you're all finished. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.